Welcome to a new Houdini tutorial. This time we are going to recreate the Patronus effect from the Harry Potter series. We are going to use a bunch of techniques such as particle and smoke advection, see how we can get our simulation to stick to deforming geometry, and make further modifications post-simulation. We are going to render everything using Redshift and then use Nuke to composite all of our layers to get the final look. So I hope you will enjoy this course, and let's get started. Before we get started, I want to do a very brief overview of what we are going to be creating. So here I am inside of Houdini, and this will be the final project file, and you can download this project file, and in case you get stuck, you can reference this file, and really you can use this project file however you want. So inside this effects container over here, this is where we are going to be creating all of the effects. And basically, if I go up, all of these other nodes here, maybe I could recolor these. These are just going to be used to render it. So each of these containers are just going to contain one object. So usually just an object merge, as you can see. And these are basically just to render out the elements separately. But all of the effects will be inside this effects container. So I have to give a slight warning. I will be going rather fast because this will be a lot to cover. So this tutorial is more aimed towards more advanced beginners or early intermediates. So either way, you would need some Houdini basics or fundamentals in order to follow along and understand what I'm really doing here. And on that note, if you are a complete beginner in Houdini, I will have to recommend the Applied Houdini series from Stephen Nipping, and these are some of the highest quality Houdini tutorials that you can find, probably the best Houdini tutorials that you can find, really. And in order to follow along with what I'm doing here, I will highly recommend, well, all of the series are really good and you should really watch all of them, but I will recommend for this case particularly, you can watch this Particles 1 Fundamentals, and this is a free course. So go ahead and watch this if you haven't already, and then really most of the stuff that I'm doing inside of this tutorial are going to be based on this Particles 2 Velocity Fields course, again from the Applied Houdini series. So if at any point you get a little overwhelmed by what I'm doing in this course, just go ahead and watch these two courses to get a more fundamental understanding of how things work. So let's go ahead back in our project file, and we will be creating everything step by step. So you will see me place all of the nodes and adjust all of the settings. So you can 100% follow along if you want. I would recommend that maybe first you watch everything. So maybe you can watch everything at a higher speed. So maybe at 1.5 or 2 times the speed. So just watch everything through and through, and then maybe watch everything again and try to then recreate the steps that I'm showing. So anyway, you will be provided with a very simple alembic animation. So we start over here with this alembic node, and this animation you will find inside the downloads folder. And then this whole chain over here is preparing the mesh for simulation. So from this original mesh we end up with something that looks like this. So we have, this will be a watertight geometry, and we will have consistent geometry along the entire mesh. So this will make things easier when we simulate, and stuff like collisions and everything will be a lot more beneficial to have this kind of mesh rather than an unoptimized mesh. Then we move over to the right and we start with the body particles, and this will be the result for the body particles. So we will be generating a curl field and then advect the particles by this curl field inside this PubNet, and then we will make our particles stick to the deforming geometry, so to the animation. And then we just simply give some color over here with some ramps. And then moving over to the right, we have our core particles, and this is actually the smoke simulation. So first we will just simulate some smoke from a sphere, and then over to the right we will use this velocity field to advect our particles, and this will be the result. Okay, and finally we have just a very simple overall smoke across the entire mesh, which looks something like this. And over here we have some extra stuff, and this will probably make sense only when we get to the rendering section. Okay, so basically we split everything up into their separate containers and we render all the elements one by one, and then we composite everything inside of Nuke. So this is pretty much the entire project, and we can get started in the next lesson. So we can get started, and here I am inside a new project. And just a couple of things to keep in mind here. I have just a few settings here that stray from the default settings. So if I go in my viewport here and I press D on my keyboard, inside the guides tab we have this draw time FPS option on, so this will show us our FPS when we preview our timeline. And also we have this geometry information is set to always on, so when we have an object on our screen it will also show the number of points and also the total number of voxels. So this is just useful information to have on the screen. And inside the background tab I just have this color scheme set to dark, so the default is light and I just set this to dark. So these are the settings I use all the time, and I will save this as default. Alright, so with that being said, let's go ahead and I'll create a geometry container, and I will just name this to FX, and we will create all of our effects inside this geo container. Let's step inside, and the first thing that we will do is let's drop down an Alembic node and let's go ahead and import our Alembic animation. So I'll press P to show up the parameters, and let's go ahead and import this anim.abc file that is provided with the downloads, and here is our animation. So we can play this, and this is what it looks like. And by default this Alembic node will import the geometry as a packed object. So let's set this load as, let's set this to unpack Alembic delayed load primitives. And now we can see that previously, let's reset this option, so we can see here that we are working with 1 prim and 1 points, and when we set this to unpack we now have access to all of the points and all of the primitives, as we can see here. Alright, so you can see that this geometry is fairly low poly, so this is more of a game mesh. And realistically, in a production setting for a VFX shot, you would probably receive from the animation department or the modeling department, you would receive a higher quality geometry. So something with a bit more polygons, a bit more detail, and the higher the resolution of the geometry that you receive is, the better the final effect will look. But this is the animation, or rather the mesh that I had available, so this will work just fine for our purposes. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you will probably be working with high resolution meshes in a production settings for VFX. Right, so now regardless of what kind of geometry that you are working with, you will probably receive a mesh that's not really optimized for simulation. So you can see that in the case of this mesh, if we look at this topology, we can see that the topology is really more dense around the head here. So around areas of interest, you would likely have more topology than in other areas. So we can see that there is a larger spread throughout the polygons over here when compared to over here. And this is true of any kind of character mesh. You would have a lot more polygons on the face rather than the rest of the body. So this might cause some problems down the line when we are trying to simulate, because when we create the simulations and we use the meshes as sources, we will set up attributes on the points, and we will use those attributes to drive certain movements throughout the simulation. And ideally we would want the points to be evenly spaced to ensure a nice consistent result of the simulation. So this is most of the time fixed if we just drop a scatter and we scatter a bunch of points, and we can see that by default this will just create a bunch of evenly spaced points throughout the mesh. But with this we will run into some problems when we want to create some collisions. So if we look at this mesh, you might receive a mesh that has holes inside of it, and we can see maybe over here at the mouth there's a hole, and so when we would convert this to a VDB we might not get the result that we want. And the bottom line here is that we would be a lot more beneficial if we could somehow make this into a watertight mesh. So this means that it has no holes and no manifold geometry, so no protruding geometry, and also try to get evenly spaced points on the mesh. So basically just optimize it for simulation, and let's see how we can do this. So I will get rid of the scatter node and let's go to the beginning of the timeline. So this is the first frame, and I will drop down a time shift, and I just want to freeze this geometry at the first frame. So we will be generating the geometry on this frozen first frame, and then we will take this new geometry and update its position based on the original geometry. And we will see how this works in a second. So what I want to do from here is let's drop down a scatter node and let's just scatter a bunch of points. So let's maybe go with 10,000 and let's convert all of these points now into VDB. So let's create an SDF field. So I'll drop a VDB from particles. And I will start by setting the point radius scale to a lower value here, so maybe 0.1, and I will just decrease this voxel size, so maybe let's try 0.03, let's maybe try 0.5. Alright, so we have quite a bit of voxels now, 1 million voxels, and let's drop down the point radius scale until we sort of get the silhouette of our shape back, so of our mesh. Let's maybe drop this down a little bit more, and maybe more, and we can see that we are not getting anything now, so we have to increase this back. So maybe 0.008 will be fine. And now from here I will drop down a convert VDB, and we want to convert this to polygons. And here we have it, and we might want to increase this adaptivity setting just a bit, just so we are not working with so many points. And now we have a watertight mesh, so we got rid of any holes that might have been inside the geometry, and we can bring some of this original shape of our mesh back if I just ray this to our original mesh. Okay, and let's preview this ray and let's set the method to minimum distance. And we can turn off show guide geometry, and this is what we have. And the normals got a little bit messed up, but it's fine, because all of these steps over here is essentially just to get rid of any holes or protruding geometry that might happen. So from here I will drop down a VDB from polygons, and again I will just set this voxel size maybe down to 0.005, and let's maybe set this to an even smaller scale, so 0.002. Alright, and let's drop down a VDB smooth SDF. Let's see, so smooth SDF, and this will just smooth out our VDB, and we will leave this as the default settings. And we will convert this back to editable polys, so let's drop down a convert VDB, and I will set this to polygons again. And let's press Shift W and preview our geometry, so we might want to increase this adaptivity a little bit. And also let's preview our original mesh, and we can see now that because of the VDB smooth we lost a little bit of the thickness of the mesh overall, so we might actually want to increase this ISO value just a bit. So I will just increase this with very small increments just until our VDB is outside of our original mesh. So we can see that I templated the original mesh, and I'm just looking for the outlines of where the original mesh was, and I just want to increase this ISO value a little bit. So maybe something like this will be fine. Alright, so from here I can drop down a remesh. And for this remesh I will set the target size to maybe 0.002. Let's see how this will look. Let's maybe make this a little bit more dense. Let's go with 0.001. So this pretty much does the trick. We have watertight geometry and we have consistent resolution over the entire mesh. And let's maybe set the iterations here to maybe 10, just so this will respect the spacing throughout the points a little bit more, so it will make them a little bit more even if we increase the iterations here for the remesh. So from here we can see that we have we got the mesh a little bit clumpy, and we can drop down a smooth SOP. And I will just set the scale, the method here to curvature dominant, so this will respect the curvature a little bit more, and we might want to increase the filter quality to maybe 4 and just increase the strength to maybe 50. So this will just help to smooth the mesh out a little bit. It won't really make much of a difference, but we might as well have it here. And let's overlay it with our original mesh, and we can see that this roughly respects the shape of the original mesh. Okay, so this will be the new mesh, and we want this new mesh to have the same animation as our original mesh. So from here I will drop down an attribute wrangle, And we will want this new mesh over here, so maybe I can drop down a null and I will rename this to new mesh. And we want to look at our original mesh, so let's make some room over here. So maybe I'll drop down a null here and I will rename this to original mesh, and I will place this inside our second slot over here for the attribute wrangle. And let's organize these nodes a little bit. So we want the new mesh to look at our original mesh and grab the position attribute from it. And we will use the XYZ dist and premuv functions for this. And again, these are the functions that we use in pretty much all of the courses. I use these every time, and I have this separate video here, so VFX Essentials, XYZ dist and premuv explained. So if you go over to my YouTube channel, this video goes in depth explaining how these functions operate. So make sure you watch this video first if you haven't. And let's go back in Houdini. So I will use this wrangle here to grab the attributes from the original mesh, and let's rename this to grab atters, and we will say XYZ dist, and we want to look at our input 1, which is our original mesh. We want to look from our current position, and we will store the I at prim, so the primitive number, and then the vector v at uvw, so the location on the primitive where we want to grab the attribute from. Okay, so now we can use a separate wrangle, so let's drop down a separate wrangle here, and we will rename this to update p, and we want to look at our moving mesh, so this alembic over here. Okay, so we want to say that let's grab the position, so vector pos, so I'll just create the variable because it might be a little bit more clearer this way. So we want to grab the position from the animated geometry by using the attributes that we got with this grab atters wrangle. Alright, so vector pos equals premuv, and we will say let's look at our animated mesh, so input 1. We want to grab the p, so the position, and we want to grab it from the I at prim, which we stored, and v at uvw. Okay, so now we have stored the position, and we will just say that the current p will be equal to this pos. And we can see now that the current geometry is squeezed in a little bit. So essentially what this does is it kind of works as a ray. So this geometry that we had initially, if I turn this off, is getting pushed towards this geometry over here, which, because this is a little bit lower resolution, we have sort of like these a little bit ugly bumps that are caused by the polygons being a little bit bigger. But anyway, what we have as a result is that we have this original geometry that is okay for simulation, and we have the same animation as we had with the original geometry. And one thing that we can do here to help a little bit smooth this out is we can just simply add a subdivide node after this alembic. So I'll grab both of these wires and I'll just drop down a subdivide, and hopefully this will help a little bit smooth things out. And let's get rid of this wire here. And we can see that the remesh is cooking, so all of these operations here will have to recook when we add the subdivide. But as a result, we have this animation now. Alright, so this is what we are going to use to simulate, to run our simulations over, and also this will be a lot better when we turn this into a VDB that we use for collisions, and it will just make our life a lot more easier down the line. And in this case, if I go back to this geometry over here, we could have probably used this geometry as it is to create all of our effects, but again, in a production setting you might receive some kind of messed up meshes, so you will have protruding geometry, you will have holes in the geometry, so that will cause a lot of trouble down the line. And so it's a good thing to know how you can generate a new watertight mesh with consistent density in the topology, and then use these two nodes to keep the animation that you had originally. Alright, so from over here we can maybe just drop down a file cache, and we will just cache this out so we don't have to recook this every time. And I'll select a folder here. And let's I'll just give this a name. Let's go with remeshed, and I'll get rid of this version here, and I'll just save to disk. And before we go ahead and start working on the simulations, just a couple more things that you have to consider is first the scale of your mesh. And so again, a lot of times the geometry that you bring inside of Houdini will have a sort of wacky scale. So you might have a mesh that's too big or too small, and you will have to modify the scale. So I will just drop down a transform here. And in this case, I want to make this mesh just a little bit bigger. So we can see that this mesh roughly covers a length of maybe 1 unit. So it goes from 1 over here to -1 over here. So maybe if this is 0.5 and this is -0.5, this covers maybe the length of 1 unit. And this is just a little bit too small. I usually, for this kind of effect, so this is, which is a little bit more localized and a little bit more of a smaller scale, I know from experience that I want something that fits roughly in a 5 by 5 by 5 meter box, or rather Houdini units. So you can probably drop down a box over to the right and you can template it, and you can set the uniform scale to 5. And so this is roughly how tall this should be. So maybe I will go to this transform and I will just increase this until it sort of matches the volume of this box. And I will maybe just set this to a uniform scale of 3.5. Now I know this from experience and doing a lot of magic effects, so usually of course this depends a lot on the scene and what kind of effect that you're working with, but usually if you're trying to do an effect that's contained in a 1 by 1 by 1 volume, that's a little bit too small. So I would go for something that's 5 by 5 by 5 or 10 by 10 by 10. Obviously if you're working on a huge scale explosion, then you would go with 50 by 50 by 50 or something like that. But for this example, a 1 unit length is a little bit too small, so I will just scale this up just a little bit, so maybe by a factor of 3.5. So long story short, scale does matter quite a bit when you're working with simulations, so that's something to keep in mind. Also, one last thing that we can do to this mesh is we can add a rest attribute. So let's go ahead and I'll drop down a rest, and we want to generate the rest on the first frame. The frame doesn't really matter, so I'll just drop down a time shift here and I will just freeze this at the first at the first frame and plug this into the second input, which is the rest position. So now we have a rest attribute, and later down the road we will use this rest position to noise up our sources, and by using this rest, the noise will stick to our geometry. So we can go ahead and grab all of these and press Shift O, and this will become, let's maybe drop down a sticky note here, and I'll right click and set text size to medium, and I'll rename this to Optimize Mesh. Alright, and now we can finally start our simulations. So let's start working on the body simulation, and I'll go ahead and I will grab this mesh and we will create a separate chain over here. So I just copied this null node, so Control C, and let's create, maybe let's start our chain over here. So I'll drop down in Object Merge and I'll just merge my mesh over here so we can start working on our simulation in a different chain. So let's go to the first frame. So the way that this is going to work is we are going to create the simulation on just one frame of this animation, and then we are going to use exactly the same technique we used over here to move this simulation to our animated geometry. So let's go ahead over here, and we want to select a frame that doesn't really have as much distortion. So let's maybe scroll the timeline, and I want to have a frame here that's something like this. So maybe I'll drop down a time shift here and I want to freeze this at frame 142. The reason being is that we want the mesh to be in sort of like a rest position, and it's not really that important, but it will just ensure that we have more smooth results. So maybe if I were to select a frame that's here, which has this limb all bended like this is not really ideal for a rest frame. So we want the limbs as stretched out as possible and just overall have as less bend in all of the joints as possible. So let's just go with 142. Like I said, it's not terribly important in the case of our mesh because this isn't a really super dynamic animation, but if you had a character animation that has some really dynamic animation with a bunch of bended joints, then you might want to be careful which frame you use as a rest position. So anyway, from here we will just create a simple curl field that will drive our particles. So to do this, we will need first a container that contains all of this geometry and probably something that's a little bigger than the geometry. So let's drop down from here a bounce, and let's go ahead and just increase the lower padding and the minimum padding. So let's maybe use 1.5 and 1.5, and let's preview this time shift and template the bound. So maybe actually even more. Let's go with 2.5 and 2.5. So we have to make sure that there is enough room between the geometry and the bounds of the container. So from here now I can create a VDB, and this will be our vel. So let's rename this to vel, and the type will be vector float, and we want to use displacement, velocity, acceleration. Voxel size should be good for now, so 0.1, and we will now activate this VDB. So let's drop down a VDB activate, and we want to use this bounds object as a reference, and we will set this to reference. Okay, so now we have created this volume, and let's go ahead and create this curl field. So let's drop down a volume VOP from here, and let's go inside, and from this position we want to generate a vector to vector 4. So we want to turn this into a vector with 4 components because we want to add the time dimension as well. So from here now we can drop down a curl noise, and this will detect it as a signature 4D noise. So we can also use the time to animate this curl field. So from here I can simply export this back to our velocity. So I will use a bind export, and I will set the type to 3 floats and set this name to be vel. Alright, so we can see it here. Let's also maybe promote some of these values here. So I will promote the frequency, the amplitude, and the roughness, and this should be fine. Let's go up, and the way we can preview this velocity field better is we can drop down a volume slice, and we can use pretty much any plane for this and drop this inside a volume trail and plug this second input of the volume trail back to our volume VOP. Okay, so we can kind of see how this is working now. And if I play the animation, we also have the noise evolving over time, and this is because we use this vector to vector 4 thing over here. Alright, so if I go up, we can see we have the frequency here, so we can maybe increase this frequency. Maybe I'll use something like 2. And this fourth value over here, this is how fast the noise will go. So if I look at this now and play the animation, we can see that this is going pretty fast. So we might want to turn this down maybe to a value of 0.5. Okay, so now it's evolving a little bit slower. And now we can use our mesh to modify this curl field so that all of the spinning is revolving around our mesh. And to do this, first we need to turn the mesh into an SDF volume. So from this time shift over here to the right, I will drop down a VDB from polygons, and let's use the default settings, should be fine. And I want to use this fill interior option here, and I'll just plug this directly into the volume VOP as the second input here. So inside here you can see that this curl noise has this SDF option over here, and we can now point this SDF to our second input. Okay, and if I go up and preview the volume trail, we can now see that this we have these curls over here where our geometry is. And maybe we can modify this volume trail a little bit, so maybe I can decrease this maximal value. And maybe let's go to this volume slice and let's choose a different plane here. Alright, so maybe we can look from the front and we can see that we have these nice swirls here where our geometry is. And also here as well. And this will be a bit more noticeable when we do our particle advection. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and let's do just that. So let's create a source for our particles. So let's go to this time shift and let's drop down an attribute VOP. And inside this attribute VOP, let's rename this to add noise. So we will step inside, and inside here we will use this veins node to create an interesting source. So if I plug this directly into the P and I plug the amount into the CD to preview this, we can see that this is the result. So this is pretty cool because it creates this kind of cool thin lines, and when the particles get advected, it will help to create a more interesting effect. So here I might increase the noise frequency maybe just a bit, and I will actually leave these settings as they are for now. I will just promote this V offset value over here, so the vein offset. So I will promote this, and here I also want to filter these veins through a ramp. So let's drop down a ramp here, and let's set this to a spline ramp, and let's go up and let's make some adjustments to the ramp. So let's reset the ramp by holding Control and middle mouse clicking this ramp title over here, and let's expand this, and I just want to squeeze these values a little bit. So let's drop down another dot over here, and I'll just bring this down and select all of these handles by holding down Shift, and I will set their interpolation to B-spline, and I will just squeeze this a little bit just so we end up with these lines. And we can see that for this vein offset, if I scroll this value, we can see that these are animating. So we might want to have some animation as well. So here I will just set this to an expression $T. So this will be our current time. And maybe this is a little bit too fast. So let's do $T divided by 2. So this will slow it down by half. Maybe divided by 3. Alright, so this should be fine. And we also want to combine these veins with just a normal noise. So from the P here, I will drop down an AA flow noise, and we want to fit this to a new range, and then we will simply multiply our original result from the veins with this AA flow noise value. Let's go ahead and increase, or rather decrease, the source min and the source max, and we might want to increase the frequency a bit and maybe turn down the roughness. Let's also just preview this without any shading, so let's disable the lighting. Alright, and let's just play around with some of these values here. So something like this. Okay, and we will let's promote the frequency and the flow, and if I go up, we can animate the flow by using the $T expression as well. So let's set this here, and we just noise up the source further like this. And I think this will be just fine. Let's go ahead and inside here, before we export this to our CD, let's export this to a dedicated attribute. So let's drop down a bind export, and let's rename this to density. So we will use this density attribute to generate particles. So from here I can drop down a popnet, and let's step inside. Let's go to our source and let's turn off the guides. Let's use emission attribute. Let's use the density. You could also use the CD here, but I just want to keep these separate. And for this emission attribute to work properly, we have to enable the scale point count by area. And we will reduce the reference area to maybe, let's start. So the lower you reduce this value, the more particles you will have. So maybe I'll start with 0.1, and let's preview. And I think this will be fine. Let's go ahead and right click this box over here, and I'll just set the particles to display as pixels. Okay, some things we can do here right off the bat is we can go inside the birth tab, and we might want these to last maybe 2 seconds and have a live variance of maybe 0.4. And let's go up, and we can see that we are working with roughly 80,000 points. Let's maybe just increase this constant birth rate. So you can either increase the particle count if you go to the reference area and you make this value smaller, or you can increase it over here in the constant birth rate. I'll just set this to maybe 10,000. So we should have roughly around 150k particles, right? 160k. And this should be enough information for us to move forward, and we will create some low resolution simulations first, and then we will just update the count to maybe roughly around I think 5 million points should be good for this in this case. So let's go ahead and let's implement this curl field over here. I'll grab both of these nulls and bring these over and select the wires here and drop down a null, and I'll just rename this to vel, or maybe curl vel. Okay, so I will grab this, I will Control C this null, and let's go inside the popnet. Let's drop down a pop advect by volumes, and we will set the subpath to be our curl vel null, and we want the advection to be update position, we want velocity to be final velocity, and advection method I'll set to trace. So if I preview this now, we should see our points moving in the direction of our curl field. Currently they're a little bit too chaotic, and we can fix this a little bit if I go up, and after our volume VOP I'll drop down a VDB smooth. So let's drop down a VDB smooth, and let's preview our volume trail while we do this, and we can see now that the curl field is a little bit more smooth now. This might be a little bit too much. Let's do less iterations. So this is 0, this is currently without any smoothing, and let's see how this looks maybe with 3 iterations, and let's look at our particle simulation. Okay, so slightly better. Okay, so slightly more smoother result, but so first of all the speed is a little bit too high. Let's go ahead and let's set the velocity scale here to maybe 0.1. Okay, let's maybe just increase this a little bit, maybe 0.2. And we can see that we have all of these stray points over here that are kind of escaping our curl field. And this is because we don't have enough information from our SDF field over here. So this is our SDF. And this exterior band voxels, let's maybe drop down a VDB visualize tree, and hopefully we can see this a little bit better. So we can see that this is how far the SDF expands. And if I increase this exterior band voxels, we can see that we are adding we are increasing the bounds of our volume. Okay, so this so basically when our particles are stepping outside of the bounds, they no longer are affected by this SDF, so it creates this that sort of like chaotic result. When we had a value of 3 of for our bounds, when the particles step outside of it, they get all messed up. So we just have to increase the exterior band voxels here to maybe, let's use a value of 9, and hopefully this will fix some of the issues that we were having. Alright, so we can see now that they're no longer being all wild and chaotic. Okay, so this is the result. We might want to increase the frequency of this noise a little bit. Let's preview the volume trails, and let's maybe just increase the frequency here. Add a little bit more curls, and let's set this fourth value back to maybe, let's use 0.7. And let's preview the result. Now obviously this depends a lot on your personal preferences, so you can use whatever values you want, and I highly encourage you to experiment with a lot of these values and see the results that you can get. So I think this is looking pretty good. And one thing that I will do here is, because we will be using more particles, I will just increase this cache amount. So I will add another 0 here and increase this to 50 gigs. So basically this will just store it in your memory. So if you have more RAM available on your PC, you can increase this. Okay, so what we want to do from here is we want all of these particles to keep this nice swirly motion, but we want them to stick to the geometry of our mesh. Now, if I were to just recreate my original setup here, and you don't have to do this, but if I were to just grab these two over here, and I will place them here. So let's just say we do this effect outside of the simulation. Let's see what result we would get. So let's point this to here, and let's maybe just point this here, and let's preview the result. So this is the result, and this is kind of what we're looking for, but the thing here is that it's not entirely accurate because, first of all, the distance that the point has, so over here to our original simulation, some of these distances are a little bit too high, so the points are a little bit too far apart from the geometry, and as a result this might not be noticeable here. But if I were to increase the particles, and let's go ahead and I'll just decrease this reference area and maybe use a factor of 10 to increase the particle count, right, and let this simulate for a bit. Let's go ahead. We can see this is exactly what I'm talking about right here. You can see this kind of like this fracture result. Maybe I'll set this to points. You can see what's happening over here, right? It's kind of like these cracks in our simulation. So it's almost what we're looking for, but these cracks are really not what we want. Okay, so hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. This becomes more and more noticeable as I increase the particle count. So if I drop this down, let's maybe increase this by a factor of 3 and simulate this for a bit. So in our final simulation, we will be using maybe somewhere between 5 million and 10 million points. So when we simulate 2 million points, we can see that they're looking fine here. And when we push them towards our geometry, we can see that we have these cracks over here. So almost what we want, but not quite. So what we will do instead is we are going to do this operation here, but we are going to do this each frame. So we will do this thing inside the PubNet. So let's go ahead and delete these. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline. Let's preview the PubNet. I'll set this reference area back to maybe 0.01. And what we want to do basically is we have these particles being spawned on frame 1, and then they are being advected by frame 2. So when we go forward a frame, they are being advected using this velocity scale. So this node is taking place. So what we want to do is in the same substep that they are being advected, we will push them back to the geometry. And then when it runs again the next substep, it will run on the points that are already being pushed to the geometry. So you can essentially think of this as we are advecting them and then pushing them to the geometry, and then the next frame we are advecting the new position of the points and we are pushing them to the geometry each frame. So that will ensure that we have a smooth result, hopefully. So let's see how we can do this. We can do this inside a pop wrangle, but I don't know why I prefer this to do this inside a pop vop. I'm not sure why. We can do this either way, but it's nice to know how you can do this effect in a wrangle or a vop as well. So let's maybe rename this to stick to geo. So okay, we will need our geometry. Let's go up and let's go ahead, and we will need this time shift. Maybe I'll grab all of these and drop down in null here, and we will just rename this to geo. Okay, so I will grab this null, Control C, let's go inside the PubNet, and inside this PubVop we will go to the inputs tab, and for input 1 let's set this to subpath and let's place our geo here. So inside this PubVop we can now select, or rather access, our geometry from this op input 1 here. Alright, so we want to grab the position information from this geometry. So let's go ahead and from our geometry, let's drop down an XYZ distance. So this will be our input. We want to grab the attributes from our current position. And now we can use this primitive information. Let's place this inside a primitive attribute. So this will go prim to prim and then prim UV to UV. And we want to grab the P from our geometry. So let's rename this to grab P. Alright. And now we can simply update their position with this value. So I can plug this directly inside the P. And one thing that we forgot here is we also have to point to this file to look at our op input one, so our geo node. Okay, so now if I preview this, it will always stick to the geometry. It's running a little bit slower because it has to compute this, but now we shouldn't have any problems. So we no longer get that ugly looking crack effect that we had on the geometry. So this will ensure a nice smooth animation. So I can say that I'm pretty happy with this result. And one final thing that we can do to add a little bit more detail is we can add a separate curl noise to this in a separate particle VOP. So let's maybe go ahead and add another pop VOP here. And this should be pretty simple. So let's maybe reset the simulation and let's rename this to add curl. We can just go inside and let's do the same thing. Basically, let's do a vector to vector 4 and plug the time in our fourth component. Let's generate a curl noise. And we will just add this noise to our position. So we will drop down and add here. And we will just update the position of our particles with a little bit of curl noise. So this will just, I will just use this noise to add a little bit more micro details or smaller details to the overall motion. So let's just plug this here. Alright, so by default this is a little bit too extreme. Let's actually just preview this so see what we get. Alright, we messed up the whole effect, and this is because the amplitude by default, or rather the amount that's being added each time step is a little bit too high. So what we can do to mitigate this effect a little bit is we can actually use this time inc value over here. So this time inc basically is 1 divided by the FBS, so 1 divided by 24, which is a 0.00 something value, which will just scale our effect way down. So after this curl noise, I'll just drop down a multiply, and I want to multiply this with the time inc. Alright, and hopefully, I think this by default will still be a little bit too high of a value, but we will scale this down in a second. So let's preview this and see what we get. Okay, so we introduce a little bit more just overall noise that complements our swirly motions. This is probably a little bit too much, but hopefully you can see where this is going. Okay, and let's maybe just promote some of these parameters here. I'll promote the frequency, maybe amp and rough as well. So let's go up. I will maybe increase the frequency a bit. So we want, you can kind of see how this will look here, right? Because this updates every frame. So we kind of get like an instant feedback on how this will look. So let's maybe settle on a value here. All right, and we can if I drop this down to 0, so the amplitude, this curl noise will have no effect, and as I increase this, we can kind of see how this is working, and we might want to increase or decrease the roughness. So I will leave you to play around with these settings to get something that looks nice to you. But with this, we add just a little bit more overall motion. So this is just to, again, to help our curliness. This is probably too much. We'll just drop down the amplitude. So because this gets added more and more every frame, we have to be mindful of the amplitude that we are using. Alright, so this is the result. I will maybe just drop down the amplitude to 0.1. For this added curl. Alright, so I think we will settle on this final result. All that's left to do here is we will increase these particles maybe a little bit later, but for now one final thing that we have to do from here is so this is the simulation working on our static geometry, and we will just update this to our animated geometry. So from here I will just duplicate this object merge, so this is just the animation. And now because this simulation is right on the surface of our geometry, we can now update this. We can now update this simulation to our animated geometry, and it should have a seamless result. Let's do this inside an attribute VOB because we will make a little bit of modifications to our usual sticking to geometry technique. So let's drop down an attribute VOB. And actually, just as a side note here, you don't really have to do this XYZ dist and premUV thing all the time. In fact, when you have a simulation that's not really 100% sticking to the geometry, this XYZ dist premUV thing won't work, and you can totally use something like a point deform. So from here I could drop down a point deform, and I can use the rest as my frozen geometry, and I can just use the deformed points as my deforming point lattice here, and you can see that this is working just fine. It's updating with the geometry, and this is and you can see that this is pretty fast as well, even when I'm working with 1 million points. So using the point deform option is really legit, and you can totally use this as well. And in fact, a lot of cases you might want to use this. So for example, if, like I said, if this simulation wasn't sticking 100% to our geometry, so you would have, so let's maybe just I'll just show you this real quick. So maybe I'll get rid of these, so I'll just disable the sticking and all that stuff, and I'll just preview a few points. So you can see now that the points are allowed to expand further outside of the geometry, right? So this would be the simulation. The XYZ dist method wouldn't work in this case. So this is where a point deform option would be better. So if I preview this, we can see that this kind of works pretty nicely actually. Anyway, let's go back and let's re-enable this and simulate a few frames. So I'll get rid of this point deform. There's just something to keep in mind as an alternative to using the XYZ dist thing. Let's make these particles stick to our surface. So I will use the frozen geometry as my second input, and I will use the animated geometry as my third input. Because the points are updating every frame, we will have to update the XYZ dist computation every frame. So it's not really worth separating these like we did over here. We'll just make these in one node. So in our case here, since this new mesh is not updating every frame, we can compute this XYZ dist only for one frame, which is why we separated the wrangles here. But since our points, we get new points every frame, we would have to compute the XYZ dist every frame as well. Probably some of this isn't making any sense, and that's partly because I'm probably not explaining it as well as it should, but again, just please go ahead and watch this video, and hopefully things will be a little bit more clear. So let's step inside this attribute VOP, and I will just rename this to update P. And let's step inside. So we want to grab the attributes from our actually our second input. So our second input is the frozen geometry. So we will look at our current position, and we want to filter our P. So let's drop down a primitive attribute. Let's set this to look for our P, and premUV goes to UV, and we will look at our third input. So this will be, the third input is our animated geometry. Okay, so I will rename this to grab P, and if I just plug this inside our position, now we should have, let's preview the node. Okay. So now our simulation is also moving with the animation as well. And we get nice smooth results, and we don't have any weird cracks. in our geometry. Now, what I want to do here as well is I also want to, we can see that as it is right now, this is completely following the silhouette of our mesh, and I just want to distort this silhouette a little bit. So inside here, I will go ahead and I will create an AA flow noise, which will be a 3D noise, and I want to add this to our current position. So let's drop down on add. And let's plug this into our second input. So this is the result, and we will promote some of the settings, so frequency, amplitude, and roughness, and maybe flow. So let's go up. Let's decrease the amount first of all. Okay, and let's animate the flow with $T expression. So now we also have a little, let's increase the frequency. We just noise up basically a little bit this silhouette of our mesh. Okay, so something like this. So again, we are just layering up a bunch of noises here. So we can see here around the neck, if I were to set this to 0, looks like this. And with a little bit of noise, I think this just looks a little bit better. And let's give these particles some color now. So I'll just drop down another attribute VOP, and I'll rename this to set CD, and let's step inside, and we will use the rest attribute for the particles. So when we generate the particles here, because our mesh has a rest attribute, so we can see this here, and this is the rest attribute we created over here, our particles are also inheriting this rest attribute. So as a result, if I drop down a rest, let's set this to 3 floats, rest, let's do an A flow noise, and I will also fit this noise for further control. If I just drop this inside the CD, we can see that because this is using the rest, this noise now stays consistent throughout the movement of the particles, and as a result it gives us these nice trails. So if I increase the frequency here, we can see that it sticks with the particles. So this is how it looks by using the rest, and if I were to use just the global position, we will get something like this. So the noise is not sticking to the particles, and it's not following the particles along their velocity, or rather their movement. Okay, so we can promote some settings here. Frequency, let's do amplitude, roughness, and flow. Let's also promote source min and source max, and we want here to filter this through a ramp, and we will leave this as a color ramp. So let's go up, and I'll maybe increase the frequency a bit and the amplitude, and let's maybe decrease the minimum value. So this is the value for the fit, and try to sort of normalize this value a little bit. Let's maybe go ahead and just create some interesting colors here. Start with a blue, and maybe somewhere in the middle I'll use a little bit of some kind of violet color. And I want to make sure that some of these values, so if I add another handle here, and let's maybe make this sort of like maybe this color. I also want to make sure that some of these handles have a little bit more white in them. So I just want to skew this color a little bit towards white. So what will happen is, maybe I can demonstrate this with an attribute wrangle, and you don't have to do this. Let's maybe multiply the CD by a custom channel here. So I'll just name this amp. Okay, so we can see now that as I increase the colors here, when I increase this over 1, the values that have this whiteness into them will become a lot more brighter. The colors, when you multiply the colors, and we will do this at render time with the material, we will have some very nice specular white values inside of them. So maybe we can see here that as I increase the amplitude, so as I make these colors brighter and brighter, they become more white. Alright, and this will help us a great deal when it comes to grading and adding the glow effects and stuff like that. So again, just make sure that some of these handles here have a little bit more white into them. Let's make the last one also sort of like a blue, and we can see that we are not having the full range. So if I make this green, we are not getting this green anywhere, so we might have to play around with some of these values here. Actually, I kind of like this green. I might keep this this happy little accident. Yeah, I'll keep this green. Maybe just maybe make this a little bit more blue. But overall, I kind of like this green. Alright, I think this works. Maybe add a little bit more darker value here to increase the contrast. So this is up to you how you decide to. I think this is way too much pink. So we can see that the Patronus effect originally from Harry Potter is like this, is just one uniform color, so it's all blue. But I mean, you can totally do this. This is up to you. Obviously, you can choose whatever colors you want, but just for my own personal taste, I always like to use like maybe we have a dominant color, in this case being blue, but I also just want to have slight tints of other colors inside them. So maybe I'm looking for something of a 70% blue and maybe a 30% other colors, maybe a 20% violet, so 70% blue, 20% violet, and maybe 10% green. Just a little bit more interesting to me, as at least. So let's maybe just push these values around a little bit, and I think this will be fine. Also in Nuke later we will do more grading to this, so we just really need a starting point here. What I also want to do here is implement a little bit of our age in our coloring. So let's go inside here, and I want to bind import the age. Let's fit this age. So we know that the age goes from roughly 0 to a value of maybe 2.2. So this is taking into account the variance, which was 0.4. Anyway, maybe 2.2 should be fine. And let's see if we multiply this ramp with our age. Let's see what we get. Alright, so we kinda messed it up a little bit. Let's go up and let's maybe make this a little bit more white. So they're going to be whiter when they first spawn, and I don't know, maybe let's switch things around a little bit and make them a little bit more dark towards the end here. Let's play around with this fit. Maybe I want to decrease the source max, or maybe increase the source min. I have no idea what I'm doing here, to be honest. Just playing around with some of the settings. I don't know. We have some interesting color variation, honestly. I think this should be fine. I think this is fine either way, honestly. Yeah, whatever. This is fine. We're gonna make adjustments later anyway. I've been fiddling around with some of these values, and I'm reaching the point of diminishing returns. So I'm just gonna leave this as it is for now. Yeah, whatever. This is fine. So I'll drop down a null, and this becomes our body, right? So I think we are done. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to cache the particles. We can cache them maybe over here after we update their position. So I'll drop down a cache. So let's drop down a file cache. Let's disable version, and let's choose a folder, and I'll name this to body sim, and let's go ahead. So currently we are working with 1.6 million points, and let's step inside here. So we want, if we want roughly 10 million points. Let's maybe go with 5 million, so we can always just grab the calculator and we can do 5 divided by 1.6. So we need to increase this to a factor of maybe 3. So we can either go here and decrease this to 0.03. Let's maybe go in the birth tab and maybe just, so I can increase this value here by 3. Let's maybe go with 4. Okay, and let's simulate a few frames. So I think that this will be dense enough. This should give us a pretty good result, and because the camera is going to be kind of further away, we don't really need too many particles. If the camera would be a close-up shot like this, we would probably need more particles, but in this case this value should be fine. So I can go ahead and I will just save this out. So this whole chain here will be our body particles, and I will press Shift O to encapsulate all of these nodes, and I will just grab this sticky node and place it here, and I'll just rename this to body PRT, so body particles. And now we can start working on our core. So here is our particles, and we can see that after a couple of seconds we end up with roughly 6.5 million particles, and this should be plenty to work with. Alright, let's start working on our particles, and we will start with a fresh object merge. So I will just grab this object merge and I will just paste this over here. So I'll just duplicate this, and we want to just grab our animation. So we will create a sphere in the center of our mesh, roughly around this the upper kind of the upper torso area over here, where sort of like the heart would be. So just that it makes a little bit more sense, that it's sort of like the soul of this Patronus effect. So with that being said, we can see that we could just place a sphere and just manually adjust it, or manually place it right here or where we wanted it, but the mesh is kind of moving a little bit, and what we want to do is we could just drop down an extract centroid from over here, and this will just give me a point to the center of mass of our geometry. Alright, which will be, let's maybe switch this to points, so maybe we can see it over here, and it will update a little bit with how the mesh is moving. Okay, and we can from here drop down a transform, and we can further adjust this positioning. So I will just press enter in my viewport, and I will just bring this out over in the Z direction and just roughly position this where I want it to be. So maybe somewhere around this place right here, and we can see that it kind of follows the mesh a little bit by doing it this way. And now what we can do is we can just drop down a sphere. Let's maybe start with this as a polygon, and I will just give this a bunch of frequency. Let's maybe press Shift W to visualize our topology. Maybe I'll go with a higher frequency, maybe 50. Okay, so what we can do here is, and actually I'll just make the uniform scale here 0.5, so I'll just make this slightly smaller. So I can drop this into a copy to point SOP, and I can point the target points to my transform over here, which is the point that we computed with the extract centroid. So now we have a sphere that's kind of following the animation, and it's right where we want it to be. Let's maybe just make this sphere just slightly smaller. So I will adjust this uniform scale value just a bit. Alright, and on this sphere, let's give this some noise attributes before we use the copy to points. So I'll just drop down an attribute VOP from my sphere, and I will just rename this to set density. Okay, and I will go inside, and from my P, I'll just drop down an AA flow noise, and I will fit this range and plug this into the CD. And before we plug this into the CD, let's just bind export this to a separate attribute that we call density. Okay, so we just use basically the CD to visualize our noise, but we use the density to generate our attributes and later to rasterize the volume. Okay, and for this AA flow noise, let's promote frequency, amplitude, maybe roughness and flow, and also for the fit, source min and source max. So let's go up and let's play around with some of these settings here, and I will disable the lighting, and let's start by increasing the frequency and maybe decreasing the minimum value here for the fit, and also maybe decreasing the maximum value as well. And maybe I'll just increase the frequency even more, and we can animate this by setting the flow to be an expression $t, and maybe I'll divide this by a value of 4. So let's play this, and maybe this is a little bit too slow. Let's divide it by 2, and I think this is better. Okay, so when we copy this when we use this copy to points, our noise will be sticking to the animation. Alright, so this is good, and we can use this density attribute that we set up to create a volume. So let's drop down a volume rasterize attributes from my copy to points, and we want to rasterize the density. And by default the particle scale is a little bit too large, and usually I set the voxel size and the particle scale roughly around the same size. So let's maybe start with 0.1 as well. And because this is kind of a small object, we will have to decrease this voxel size just a little bit. Maybe let's try 0.03. Okay, and I will also maybe decrease the particle scale to maybe 0.05. It's important that the particle scale is not really too low. So if this was 0.02, for example, the smoke is a little bit too thin, so it's a lot more sparse this way. So we want to have a little bit of smoke thickness, so I will set the particle scale to 0.05. We can change this later depending on how our simulation will look. So we will import this as a source, so this will be volume rasterized attributes, and this will be a density source. So I'll just drop down a null, and I will set that this is density src. So this will be our density source that we will import in a second in a .NET. And actually let's do that just now. Let's go to the beginning of the timeline, and I'll drop down a network, and I will grab this density source. So I will select this and press Ctrl+C, and let's step inside and let's build this network up. We will need a smoke object sparse. We will need a pyro solver sparse. And you can also use the smoke solver sparse, but I usually like to use the pyro solver just because it has a little bit more options. But it's pretty much the same thing. The smoke solver is just a simpler version of the pyro solver. Anyway, so we will need a volume source. Now let's drop down a volume source, and let's set the subpath to point to our density source that we created, so the one with the rasterized attributes. And this volume source, so I can rename this to density source, this will be plugged inside our sourcing tab for the pyro solver. And by default for the density source, I always have this enlarge fields to contain sources option on, and this will ensure that on the first frame of simulation the container that is generated is big enough to contain our source. So it will look outside of this network, and it will look at our source object, which is this over here, and it will make sure that this container is big enough that it contains everything for the source. And for the operations, I will click this plus, and I will say the source volume will be density, and we want the target field here to be density. And I will leave the source scale as 1 and operation as add. So now we should have our smoke starting to simulate, and because we don't have any forces, it's kind of static. Let's maybe go first, and let's also decrease this voxel size maybe to 0.035. And this should be enough resolution for this effect. And from here I also want to generate a velocity field that will push out our smoke outwards. Okay, so we will create this again by using this sphere. So this sphere over here, and after we set the density, let's also create another attribute VOB. So let's make this inside a separate VOB, and let's give this some velocity. So I will rename this to set V, and we will use this to set the velocity. So we will generate a vector that points outwards from the center of our object, and since the center of our object is the center of our scene, we can do a subtraction here. So I will grab this P, so this is the position of the points. I will subtract from this a vector. So for this input 2 here, I will set this to be a constant, and we will set this to be a 3 floats, and I'll leave this as a vector that's 0, 0, 0. So this will be a vector that's right in the center of our scene. So if I were to, let's preview this by using the normals, just because it's easier to visualize this with the normals a little bit better. So if I turn on the normals, we can see that this is the vector. Let's also make sure that this is normalized, and I'll just place down a normalize here, and this will be our vector. So we can add some noise to this vector as well, and let's from this P I will generate a turbulent noise, and I will set the signature to be a 3D noise, and maybe I will use simplex noise, and we will just add this to our normalized value over here. Alright, and we can increase the frequency and maybe the amplitude, and we will just add a little bit of noise to this. And we can actually promote these values here. So I'll promote the frequency, offset, amplitude, and roughness. And let's go up, and I'll just increase the roughness maybe a little bit. And we can animate any of these offset values here. So maybe I'll just animate this offset Y coordinate, and I'll set this to be $T. And let's see how this will look. So I think this is pretty good. Maybe I'll just divide this value. Maybe I'll just divide this value by 2. So just make this slightly slower. Alright, and I think this will be fine. Let's see how this will look in our simulation. So as a separate chain from here, let's do another volume rasterize attributes. And for this, we will rasterize our N attribute. So we plug this inside the normal. Let's actually just plug this inside the V, just because usually you would be creating a velocity vector. So let's get rid of this connection by holding Y, and alright, this is plugged into the V, and this is renamed, and this is named to set V. Okay, and let's keep everything consistent, and the attributes that we want to rasterize will be V. Alright, let's decrease this particle scale a little bit, and let's visualize this by dropping down a volume slice from here. Okay, and let's maybe do a volume trail and plug the second input to our volume. So now we can kind of see a little bit what we are doing, and we want to add a little bit more resolution to this field. So let's maybe use a voxel size. We could use the same voxel size of 0.035, but maybe I think this is a little bit too much, so maybe I can just use a 0.05 value. And I will just decrease the particle scale to maybe 0.1. And we really want just to have some initial movement outwards from the sphere, so we can keep this fairly simple, and I'll just leave this as it is, and I'll grab these wires and drop down a null here, which I will rename to VSRC. And I will grab this VSRC, and let's step inside the DOBNet. Let's drop another volume source, and I will place the subf to point to my VSRC that we just created. And for the settings here, we want the operation to be, let's use for source volume we will use V, and the target field will be vel, and we want the field rank to be vector. I'll leave this as add for now, and let's grab these and merge these together. Alright, so now they are merged, and let's see how the default settings will look. Okay, so now the smoke is being pushed outwards, which is great. And I think maybe this is a little bit too fast. It's kind of nice actually, but maybe I'll just reduce the source scale to, let's use a 0.6. Alright, and let's add some turbulence as well. So let's drop down a gas turbulence. And I usually like to have one bigger turbulence and one smaller one. So let's just rename this to turbulence. So turb big, and let's visualize the turbulence. And maybe I'll increase the swirl size for this one. And I'll just decrease the scale a little bit. Okay, and let's create another one and disconnect this one so we can visualize the new one. And I'll just maybe make the swirl size for this a lot smaller, and maybe also drop down the scale a little bit. So I will also merge these two, and these are plugged inside the forces tab over here. Okay, so let's disable the visualize turbulence here, and let's see what we get. So I think this is looking pretty fine. Let's set up a collision. So we want this smoke to collide with the inside of the mesh. Let's go up and we will do a VDB collision. So from this object merge over here, so this is the animation, we will convert this to an FDS. So let's drop down a VDB from polygons. And for my voxel size, you should use the same voxel size, roughly the same voxel size as you have in your smoke object here. So I will just right click this and copy parameter. So this is 0.035, and I will just make this the same voxel size. Okay, and let's drop down a null, and this will be my SDF collision. So we can grab this SDF collision null, and I will Control C, and let's step back inside here, and we will create a static object, and let's point the subpath to our SDF collision, and let's go ahead and merge this in our chain here, and I will place this after the pyro solver. And by default this has the option to display geometry, so I will just uncheck this, and I will go inside the collisions tab, and we want to use volume collisions here, and the mode will be volume sample. Alright, and because we want this to collide with the inside of the geometry, or rather the SDF field, I will check on this invert sign option over here. Okay, and if I go to my smoke object, we can turn on collision to debug and see if this is working. So I'll just now press play, and we can see that our collision geometry is being built around our smoke. And this is a little bit hard to see, but we can see that the collision is working, and we can now turn this off, and we can safely say that this is working, and we can see that this is stopping right around where the mesh would be. And it's working pretty fast as well. Let's also make sure that this is deforming geometry. So inside the static object, let's use this use deforming geometry option and turn this on. Okay, so this will be a very basic smoke simulation, but this will get the job done to just have this nice core effect in the center of our mesh. And maybe I will just make this smoke last a little bit longer. So inside the pyro solver, let's go to dissipation, and I will maybe turn down this value to 0.05. Okay, and we can just go ahead and maybe let's cache this. So first we will have to bring this inside the sub level. So I will drop a DOP import fields, and we will set the DOP network to be this DOP net that we created over here. And for the DOP node, we will import the smoke object. So I'll just say star, smoke, and star. So any object that has this smoke inside of the name will be imported. And for the fields, we will want to import the density. We don't actually need to import the density, but we might as well in order to visualize this. And we will need especially the velocity. So for the field here, I will type vel, and I will set the visualization for this vel field to be invisible. So if I preview this, we should have the smoke inside the sub level. Okay, so now we brought our smoke outside of the DOP net, and we can now cache out this result. So let's go ahead and drop down a file cache, and I'll disable version and select a folder, and I'll just name this to core vol for core volume, and I'll save to disk. So this will be our smoke simulation, and we will now use this simulation to drive some particles. So from here I will drop down a null, and we will set this to be let's maybe just rename this to vol for volume. Alright, and let's bring all of these over maybe a little bit. So this is our smoke simulation, so I'll press Shift O, and let's encapsulate all of these, and this will be smoke sim. Okay, and over here, so we want to use the same kind of sphere that we used for our smoke. So I'll maybe just copy this setup here, just this copy to point setup. So I'll press Ctrl C, Ctrl V. So I'll duplicate this over here, and this is the sphere, and we can use the same sphere to generate particles. And we don't really need the V anymore, so I'll get rid of this. But we can keep this density attribute for just noising up the source a little bit, and maybe I'll increase the frequency for this. Okay, and maybe we don't really need as big as frequency here, so we don't really need as much resolution. So maybe frequency 25, just so it plays back a little bit faster, and our simulation will be faster as well. So from here I will drop this inside a popnet. And we want pretty much the same settings as we did earlier. So I will disable the guide here, and the emission attribute will be density. Let's scale point count by area, and I'll start maybe with a value of 0.01. And in the birth tab, let's maybe set the life. Again, maybe I'll use a value of 2 and a life variance of 0.5. And let's take a look. This will be fine. Let's set the display here to pixels, and let's drop down a pop advect by volumes. Okay, and inside this subpath we will point to our vol over here. So let's grab this and let's place this here, and the field name will be vel, so we can make sure if we look at this volume we have this vel field over here. All right, and by default it's pointing at this vel. Let's start by using an advection type of update points, and let's use final velocity and trace and see what this gets us. Alright, so actually it's looking pretty good. And we want the particles to be always contained inside the bounds of our geometry, so inside our mesh. So we can actually just go ahead and we can just borrow the static object that we used inside our DOBnet for the smoke. So I'll just go ahead and grab these two nodes. I will Ctrl C to copy these, and I'll just bring them over in our pop simulation. And I'll place them here, and I'll just link this up. And this will work exactly the same, so we can now hopefully see that no particles are, when they are being advected outside of the mesh, they are no longer staying there. We could also just simply delete the points that are escaping the mesh, but we might as well use this. As we can see, it's pretty fast as well. Alright, so maybe these particles are moving a little bit too fast for my taste, so I'll just drop down the, maybe inside this pop advect node, I'll just drop down the velocity scale to maybe 0.5. Okay, so I'll just have the speed. Let's maybe also let's add some noise to this sphere, maybe just a little bit, so some 3D noise. So after we set the density for the sphere, let's drop down another attribute VOP, and let's actually maybe just use mountain SOP. Alright, so this will just give us an attribute noise, and we can, I think the default settings actually look alright, so I'll maybe decrease the element size a bit, and I'll go inside animation and turn on animate noise, and maybe increase the duration, so this will make it slower. I think this will be fine. Maybe I will just make the sphere for the particles a little bit smaller, so maybe 0.3. Let's maybe look how big this is in relation to the geometry. Alright, I think this will be good. Maybe this is too big here. Let's go to this and reduce the element size and maybe the amplitude. Okay, preview this. Still a little bit too big, maybe let's use 0.25. Alright, this should be good. Let's untemplate this and let's go to our popnet And by default, this PubNet will bring all of the objects, so this is why we are seeing the SDF collision. Let's only bring the object that has pop inside of it, so star, pop, and star. So now I'll play the simulation, and this will be the result. Let's maybe set up some color for these particles again, and we will use an attribute VOB from this, and actually we will use the same rest attribute thing that we did earlier for the noise. So before we simulate the particles and before we make any modifications to this sphere, let's drop down a rest, and let's just make sure that the sphere has a rest. Okay, and so we will store the rest before we do any modifications to it and before we use the copy to points. And so inside this PubNet, when we simulate our particles, the rest should point to our undeformed sphere over here. And as a result, we can go inside the attribute VOB and we will drop down a bind. Let's bring in the rest attribute, and let's generate an A flow noise. And let's also fit this, and I will plug this inside a ramp. So we will leave this as a color ramp and just plug this into the CD. Okay, and let's promote frequency, let's promote amplitude, roughness, and flow, and source min and source max. And let's go up, and maybe just to start, I will use the whitewater preset for this. And let's also animate this noise first of all. So let's set the flow here to $T, and I'll divide this by a value of 2. Okay, so the color will now change with this noise. And let's maybe play around with some of the settings here. So maybe I'll drop down the roughness, and we want to decrease the minimum value for this fit, and maybe also the maximum value as well. Alright, so we end up with something like this. And let's also use the age as well. So we want the particles to be a little bit more white in the beginning. So what we can do is we can go inside here, and I will bind the age, and I want to maybe fit this age. So let's drop down a fit, and we know they go from 0 to maybe 2.5. And let's see what happens if we can pretty much just add the value here to our color, and this will mean that they are white when they are being spawned. Currently it's going the other way around, so let's set the destination mean to 1 and this to 0. Okay, so we can see that they are really white in the beginning, and then they fade out to their regular color. Let's maybe set this destination mean. Let's maybe not add so much whiteness in the beginning, so I'll just decrease this a little bit, and I think this will be just fine. Okay, this looks good to me, and let's go up. Let's maybe spawn a little bit more particles. So I'll go to the source, and let's maybe just increase the birth rate to 50,000, and let's see how many this will give us. Okay, so after a couple of seconds we have roughly 500k, and we probably need a little bit more. Let's maybe increase this by a factor of 5. So let's go to the source, and I will set the reference area to 0.00, maybe 2. Probably this should be enough. So after a couple of seconds we end up with roughly 2.5 million points, which I think will be plenty. Right, let's maybe, just to be sure, let's maybe aim for 5 million. So I will decrease this reference area to 0.001. Okay, so this will roughly put me around 5 million, and this should be plenty, because we can always make the particles, if we want them to be more transparent, we can just make them smaller at render time, and we will see how this works in a second. But it's a little bit better to have more particles to work with in this case. So from here, from this popnet, I can now go ahead and I will use a file cache and I will just cache this out. So let's disable version and select the folder. And this will be core_prt and I will save to disk. So here are the cached particles for the core. Let's maybe just drop down a null and I will rename this to core_prt. And let's keep this nice and organized and grab all of these. And I will press Shift O to create this network, and let's copy a sticky note and I will rename this to core_prt. Alright, and the final layer that we will need is going to be just a very simple and basic smoke simulation for the entire mesh. So let's do that next. Okay, so let's set up our final smoke simulation and we will keep this extremely simple. I'll just grab one of these object merges which contains our animation and we will create this chain over here. So we want to, first we will scatter some points that we can rasterize and turn into a density volume. So drop down a scatter and we will just increase this. Quite a bit. So we will use maybe 50k points. And this should be plenty. What happens here is that because we are basically changing this mesh every frame, because this is animating, we are kind of also, you can see that the points, this scatter is being recomputed each frame. And this is probably fine, but what we can do is actually we can do the same thing that we did with the XYZ distant PrimUV thing that we kept using earlier, but we will just use the shortcut version of this. So inside the scatter point we have this output attributes tab, and we can enable primnum attribute and the primuvw attribute. So these are the primitive number and the location on the primitive number where the points are, so where the points would be on the surface of the geometry, and we get this these for free here inside this scatter node. So from here I can drop down a time shift node and I can freeze this at the first frame. So I will set this to only be frame 1, and now this is frozen, and we can either use an attribute wrangle and use the primUV function, or we can actually just do an attribute interpolate. And for my second input here, we will point to our deformed mesh, and by default you can see that this is looking for the attribute source prim and the attribute source primUV, which is these attributes here. So when we preview this, now our points are sticking to the geometry, to the animated geometry. And we can also go ahead and from here we can actually drop down an attribute VOP. And let's actually just grab one of these set the density attribute VOPs from here. I will place this here and get rid of this one. So I'll just use one of these that we already had. Okay, and we can see this now here. So now with the attribute interpolation, the noise will also stick to the surface of the geometry. Let's maybe set some settings here for this density. So let's maybe decrease the frequency. And I think this will be fine. So from here we can drop this inside an attribute rasterize, and we want to rasterize the density. Okay, so let's maybe use a voxel size of maybe 0.05, and I'll drop down the particle scale to maybe 0.1. Okay, or maybe actually we can use the same value, so 0.05. And since we basically just want to add some turbulence to this noise, we will just kind of use the shortcut version, and we will use the SOP version of the pyro solver. So from here I will place the volume rasterized attributes. So where we get our density, I'll just plug this directly inside a SOP level pyro solver. So we don't really need to set up a DOPNet with a bunch of fancy stuff. So I'll set the voxel size here to the same value of 0.05. And inside the sourcing, we don't really need any of these. We only need the density. And we will go to shape, and we want to enable turbulence. And we want this turbulence to be set the threshold field here. Since we don't have temperature, we are going to use the density. And if I play this, we have a very, very simple smoke simulation. And maybe we can also go to, let's say, Let's disable fire here. Let's go to fields and maybe increase this dissipation. Maybe let's make the smoke dissipate a little bit faster, so I'll set this to 0.15. And actually the default settings for this will be fine. We basically only want to use this smoke simulation as just sort of like a very faint aura around our particles. So this will have a very low opacity in our composite. So we don't really need a lot of detail, and we don't really need a complicated simulation. So from here I will just drop down a file cache, and we want to cache this out. So let's select a folder, and I will rename this to smoke, and I will save to disk. Alright, and so this becomes our smoke. Let's grab one of these, and we have the smoke sim here, but let's rename this to core smoke sim, and this will just be, let's say this will be body smoke. Okay, and from here I'll drop down a null, and I will rename this to smoke. So now we have all of the layers that we need, and we can start rendering these elements. So we have two layers of particles, one being our body PRT, so this layer here, and the other layer of particles will be our core PRT, this one over here. So let's first start with this body PRT. So I'll grab this null, and let's go up a level, and I'll create a new geocontainer here. So let's drop down a geometry. I'll rename this to body PRT, and let's step inside. Let's drop down an object merge and merge in our body. Okay, and we can disable the visibility for this effects geometry now. So for our body, let's go ahead, and the first thing that we will do inside this Redshift object tab, let's go to particles tab, and we will set this to render object as particles. So let's set the global scale multiplier. Let's start with a small value, so maybe 0.1. Also, I will want the particles to start at a p-scale value, so I want them to be invisible at the first frame that they spawn, and we want them to die off in time. So basically we want the p-scale to be 0 in the beginning, and then they increase in size, and then they decrease in size as the particles age. So let's go inside here, and I'll drop down an attribute wrangle, and we will map the p-scale to our normalized age, so our n-age attribute, which is basically just the age attribute divided by the life. So we will say that at p-scale equals chramp, and we will name this ramp. Let's maybe set p-scale, and we want to use our n-age attribute, and we will create the channel here for our ramp, and we want them to start at a value of 0, quickly increase to 1, and then slowly decrease over time. And maybe I'll grab these handles here, and let's set their interpolation to be B-spline. And let's add a couple more handles and make a nice smooth ramp here. So something like this. So for the majority of duration that they are alive, I want them to have a sort of like a value closer to 1. Okay, so we can rename this to set p-scale. So let's go up, and let's create also a material. So inside here I have the material context, which is this over here. Let's create an RS builder, RS material builder, and I will rename this to particles. Let's step inside, and for the material, let's press P to bring out the parameters. I will turn off the reflection here, and for the color we will want to import our point attribute. So let's drop down an RS point attribute, and this will be our CD. So we will place the out color here. Let's go to our base properties and use this as the diffuse color. And also I will plug this inside the overall, and we want to use this as the emission color as well. And also inside this material, I will go to this overall option over here, and I will start maybe with an emission weight of maybe 5. Okay, let's go up. I will grab this and Control C to copy, and place this as my, let's see, our render. Set this to be the material that we created. And also we forgot to set up a camera, so let's maybe select a cool frame here, so maybe something like this. And with this view selected in the viewport, I will hold down Control and left click this camera here, and it will create a camera with the same view. And maybe actually we can adjust this a little bit. And we will also need a ground floor, so we can just simply create a new geo container, and I will name this ground. And inside here we will simply use a grid. We basically just want this to act as a plane that catches our reflection, so we can composite this later. I'll leave this as it is for now. So we can see, we can adjust the camera a little bit, and we can make a very simple orbiting animation. I will click this lock here so we can step outside of the camera. We can create a null at the center of our scene, and I will make this cam a child of the null, so I will link these two together. So now when I select this null and I rotate this in the y coordinate, we can see that the camera is orbiting around our null basically. So if I go inside this cam1, we can create a very simple orbiting animation. So maybe we will start at around this angle here. I will hold down Alt and left click this value, and I will maybe go to frame, let's maybe go to frame around 160. Okay, and we will decrease this value now, so we will just make this camera a little bit more frontal facing. Okay, we can actually, if I go inside my effects, I can preview my mesh from here, and I can disable this body PRT for now, and we can pretty much play the orbiting animation. So just a very slight, subtle orbiting, just so it's not a boring static camera. And maybe I will bring this back a bit, so I will click on this lock icon here, and I'll just bring this out a little bit. Alright, so I think this looks good. Okay, let's step outside and let's bring back our body PRT, and let's hide these effects. So we have our camera over here. So let's go ahead and also create a material for this ground, and we will go inside our material context. Let's drop down another RS material builder. I will rename this to ground. And we will also keep this super simple. So inside the material, actually let's leave all of these settings as they are for now, because we are only interested in grabbing the reflection from this. So let's grab this ground material and assign it to our ground geometry over here. And we can go ahead probably and create our first test render. So let's go inside the Redshift render view. So you can create a new tab here, and you can choose the Redshift render view. Let's press play and see what happens. Okay, so this is the result. It's not looking terrible. Let's maybe just go ahead and start adjusting some of these particles. So inside this body PRT, we will have to make these way smaller. Let's maybe click on this plus to save a snapshot, and let's set the global scale multiplier here to maybe 0.002. And maybe we actually have to set this even smaller. Let's go with let's another 0.5, so 0.0005. Okay, so now we are kind of getting the result that we are after, and we have to keep in mind that some of these color values are a little bit blown out. So if I make some room over here, we can go to our effects here, and we can see that if I go to my color controls and turn this on and decrease the exposure, we can see that we can bring some of this whiteness a little bit down, and we will do this inside of Nuke later, but hopefully we can see how this will work. Let's go ahead, and we forgot to set the camera options here. So inside this cam, we want to go to the view, and we want to set this to full HD. So let's use the preset HDTV 1080p. So let's press play again, And now we are getting a little bit more finer result. And let's go ahead and go to the material, and I want to increase inside this particle. Let's increase the emission weight here to maybe a value of 10, and this will just give us a little bit of a brighter global illumination on the ground. So if I press play, we can see this here. And if I go to my, let's go to the color adjustments, and if I enable this color controls, we can see that we can we will bring this down for the mesh, but we have the information for this global illumination. Speaking of which, we will want separate passes for the GI, the reflection, and the emission. So let's disable this, and let's go back, and let's go to my Out tab, and inside this Redshift ROP, we will go to Output, and let's go to AOV Manager, and let's create some AOVs, and maybe I should disable the render before I do this. Let's set the first one to be, let's say, emission. Let's use global illumination, and let's also bring in the reflection. Now we will have our beauty, and then we have the emission separately, the GI separately, and the reflection separately. So we will come these together. There is a small problem here with the GI, because we are only interested in the GI on the ground, and we can go to our, so this is the material for the particles, and I will just set the weight of this color. We will actually just get rid of the color here, and I'll just make this completely dark. So we can see that now this gets rid of the particles in the GI, and we will just use the emission for our main pass for the particles. So we have the emission, the GI, and the reflection. Okay, so in the Out tab inside this Redshift ROP, let's go to the settings here, and I think a quality setting of medium will be just fine in this case. You can obviously set this to a higher value if you feel like you need it, but I think the medium will be just fine. So I'll pause this, and we can go inside the Output tab, and inside the Output tab we can go to the common, and let's give this a file path and name. So I named this body_prt.$f.exr, and we will select the frame range to be the entire frame range, so from 1 to 240, and we can go ahead and we can just render this to disk. So we will follow pretty much exactly the same process to render our core. And I will in fact grab this particles material, so I'll grab this, go in my OBJ, and let's actually first step inside our effects. Let's find our core PRT, alright, and let's make sure that this is what we want. Okay, and I'll grab this, Control C, go up, create a new geo container, and this is core. Let's step inside and drop down on object merge, and I will place the object to be our core PRT. Alright, so we can actually go up, and let's go inside our body PRT, and I will just grab this attribute wrangle over here with set p scale, and I will just copy this to our object merge over here. And I will probably want to have the particles already have some scale when they are first being born, so right at the beginning. So I will maybe just adjust this ramp a little bit to something like this. Let's go up, and let's go to our core, and inside Redshift OBJ we go to particles, render object as particles, and let's check we set our particles here to be this value. I'll just copy this value and start with the same value here and make adjustments as necessary. So for the core we will just render the core, and we are not gonna worry really about the reflections on the ground and the GI. So let's disable these objects as well and just have the core on our screen. Go inside our camera, and yep, let's grab the same materials. So for this body PRT, let's grab the materials we had for this and copy it to our core object. Okay, so if I go inside the Redshift render view and hit play, we should see our particles, our core particles. So here we have it, and again keep in mind that when we will lower the value of the colors, it will look something more like this. Okay, we are just checking to see if the size is fine. Maybe I can make this just slightly smaller. Let's take a snapshot of this, and let's make these just, let's maybe use 3 instead of 5 here. Okay, so let's compare, and I think a smaller value is a little bit better in this case. So I kind of like this value more. Alright, we'll keep this value. Let's hit stop, and we can simply go ahead and render this as it is. So inside my out tab, let's go to our Redshift ROP, and let's select here let's select a folder. Okay, so I renamed this to core_prteeth.$f.exr, and I will go ahead and I will render this to disk. So the final thing that we will have to render will be the body smoke. So let's create a separate container for it. Let's step inside the effects and let's grab our body smoke. So this will be the smoke. I will go up and create a geo container, and I will just rename this to smoke. And we don't have to see the core. And let's go inside. Let's drop an object merge and place our smoke inside this object merge. So here we have it, and let's go up. Let's create a material for this first of all. So let's create an RS builder material, and I will rename this to smoke. And inside here, this will be very simple. Let's get rid of this material node, and let's simply drop an RS volume. And I will connect this out color to the volume input over here for this Redshift material. By default, this will look for the density. So this will be fine in our case. So let's leave the settings as they are for now, and I will go up. Let's select this smoke and Control C, and I will paste this inside the render material tab over here. In order for this smoke to show in the render, we will have to set up some lights. So we can simply use a dome light for this. So let's drop down an RS dome light, and I will maybe put this here next to our camera. And for the texture, I'm just going to use texture from Polyhaven, which is going to be this query texture. Okay, and I will leave the link. If you want to use the same texture, I will provide a link in the links file, so you can get the texture yourself as well. In the light tab, let's point to our texture. So here we can see it. We don't actually need to see this in the viewport, so I will disable this. And also inside the environment, we don't want to render the environment. So let's turn off the background option over here. And by default, when we create the dome light, if we go to contribution, we can see that the volume setting here is set to 1. Okay, so this is important in order for our smoke to show. Let's go to our out tab, and let's actually just create a new custom node for this. So we'll render this separately with a different ROP. I can also rename this to RS smoke. For this, we are not going to need any global illumination, so right off the bat I can go in the Redshift tab, and I will leave the quality at medium, and I will just disable global illumination. Let's go ahead and let's maybe go to the Redshift render view, and inside this Houdini tab over here we will select the ROP, and let's make sure that this will point to our RS smoke. And let's render, and here we have it. Maybe we can go ahead and let's grab the light, and I will just increase the intensity. Okay, and let's disable bucket rendering. And maybe just increase the intensity, and the default settings are already looking pretty good. If we go inside the material, we can play around with the scatter coefficient and the absorption coefficient. So if I increase this, our smoke will be more opaque, and we can see that this isn't updating. And this is because if you go back here, if you go to effects, over here where we created the smoke with the pyro solver, this automatically assigns a material for our smoke. So if we go inside the look tab over here, we forgot to turn off this assign material option. So we can fix this basically if we just remove this show material path attribute here. So I'll just drop down an attribute delete, and inside the primitive we will just select this material show path. So now we should be able to adjust the material. Okay, and if we go back now to material, we can adjust these settings here. So the scatter coefficient will make the smoke brighter, and the absorption coefficient will make the smoke a little bit thicker. Let's maybe leave these, start with the basic, the normal values of 1 and 1, and we can do a simple trick here to get a little bit more of our mesh silhouette mixed into this effect is what we can do is let's go inside the object and let's go to the scene view. Let's step inside this effects container, and I will grab this object merge and I will just bring this over here. So this is just my mesh, and I want to convert this to a fog density. So let's drop a VDB from polygons, and this will be set to fill interior, and we want to generate a fog density. Let's maybe just hide other objects here. So this is what we end up with, and we can increase the voxel size maybe a little bit. So from here we can assign a different material for this. Let's maybe drop down a null, and let's rename this to maybe mesh mat. And let's grab this null, and I'll go up. Let's create a new geo container, and this will be my mesh mat, and drop down an object merge here. So we have just a simple fog volume of our mesh. Let's turn this back on, and we want to create a separate material for this. Let's maybe just duplicate this smoke, and this will be my mesh mat. And I will grab this and I will assign it to my mesh mat. Okay, and hopefully this will make sense in a second. Let's create another render now. And what I want to do here for my mesh mat, let's go to the volume and let's increase the coefficient here. So hopefully now you can see what I'm trying to do here. So maybe I can also decrease the scatter coefficient and make this just a little bit darker. Okay, so I can increase this, and basically with this we kind of bring a shadow of our original mesh back inside here, and as a result it will obscure kind of like the smoke that is behind the mesh, and it will just kind of make our silhouette of the mesh pop out a little bit more. So let's maybe just grab a screenshot of this and let's do another render without this mesh mat, and we can compare. So when we will overlay this new result in our composite, it will kind of help to bring a little bit more of our mesh back into the mix. Let's maybe go back to my original, so the smoke material, and I kind of want to, let's also visualize our mesh mat. And I kind of want to adjust some of the settings here, so maybe I'll make this just slightly more transparent. And maybe less visible, so maybe something like this. And we will again adjust a lot of these settings through compositing, but this will be fine. So we can actually go ahead and we will just render this. So let's step inside this RS smoke, and we will render the entire frame range here. Go to output, and I name this smoke.$f.exr, and I will hit render to disk. And the final element that we will need is going to be a mesh render, and I will just show you what I mean by this exactly. So let's go inside the effects window, and maybe I'll just encapsulate this, and I'll just make a network here, which I will just call, let's just call this extra. So here is our mesh mat, and we also want a separate container that just has this geometry. So let's maybe just drop down a null from here over to the right, and this will be mesh. I will grab this null and let's step outside and create a geo container, and this is mesh. Let's hide these two objects, and let's step inside here, drop down an object merge and place this here. So this will be simply our geometry, so our animation. Maybe in fact, let's go up a level, let's go to the effects, and I think that maybe we can use the original animation that we had. Let's go to our Alembic, so this one instead, which has just slightly a little bit more detail, so it kind of looks a little bit more like a deer. So let's actually just let's get rid of this, and I will create this over here, and we will have to set this to have the same scale as our mesh. So I will just copy this transform here. So remember that we modified the scale of our mesh, so let's just grab this transform, which just makes this bigger. Okay, and this can become this mesh object that I was talking about. And also I can maybe use the subdivision version, so drop it from the subdivide. Okay, and let's set this to be mesh. Let's copy this, let's go here back in our mesh and place this here. So again, this will be simply our mesh, and let's see what we can do with this. And we don't really need to give this a material, because what we want to generate is a couple of custom passes from this mesh. And let's see what I mean by this. In my Out tab, I will create a new Redshift custom render op, and I will rename this to RS mesh. And in the output, we want to generate a few AOVs. So let's create a new AOV, and I will set this to be a custom AOV. And I will rename this first one to AO, so this will be our ambient occlusion. And inside this custom AOV, you can see here that inside this custom tab, there is a default shader that can point to a path. Let's create this shader, and you have to do this inside the shop context. So inside your networks here, you can go to the shop context, and we will create a Redshift network. And I will rename this to AO. And inside here, there is a simple Redshift material, and I will drop down an RSAO node, and I will simply plug this inside the surface. Okay, so now I can grab this Redshift network, and I'll press Ctrl C, and I want to place this over here in the default shader for my first custom AOV. If we go to our cam and we go to the Redshift render view inside Houdini, let's select our op, so rs_mesh. By default, we will have just a basic material assigned to this mesh, and if we go to this AOV here, we can see that we have a pass that has the AOV. Let's maybe turn off bucket rendering, and let's go inside this shop, and we can make some modifications to this. So maybe I will just reverse the colors for this AO, and hopefully this will look a little bit more interesting. So I'll just reverse this color here, and if I reset the render, here you can see this is what we were aiming for. Okay, so we will basically use a few of these extra AOVs with custom shaders to help us control our look overall. So we will use this to brighten up the particles and darken up some spots, and this will hopefully make a lot more sense when we get to the Nuke section. So we have this AO shader. Let's create a new one. So let's maybe go here to the shop context, and let's create another Redshift network, and we want one that's going to be the Fresnel, and inside here I will drop an RS Fresnel, and I will simply plug this in the surface. Okay, and one more Redshift network here, and we want the UVs. So inside this I will drop down an RS vector user data, and we will look for the UV and plug this inside the surface. So let's go up and let's grab this Fresnel first. So I will grab this and Ctrl C. Let's create a new custom AOV. So let's go here, custom. This will be Fresnel, and inside the custom shader we will assign this to the shop Fresnel network. And one more AOV, and this will be another custom AOV, which is going to be our UV. And inside the default shader we'll go to shop and assign this UV. Okay, so let's see what we have. So we have the AO, we have the Fresnel. Again, this will help us with our grading, and we have the UV as well. And again, this will make more sense when we get to the Nuke section. But we have these 3 extra passes here which we can use, and let's go ahead and I will just render this. And inside the Redshift tab, let's disable global illumination since we won't be needing it. I'll leave the quality to medium. Let's select render frame range. Let's give this a name inside the common tab. And so this will be mesh.$f.exr, and I'll go ahead and render this to disk. So here I am inside of Nuke, and we can start working on the compositing. Let's first start by importing our first layer of particles, so the body PRT. So this is the render. And if I actually deselect this node and I just select an empty space here, if I press S, you can see that the color management is set to OCIO and the OCIO config is set to ACES 1.2. And this is the default that the render in Redshift will render as. As far as color configuration is concerned, and inside this root, I set the format for the project to be the full HD 1080p format. So these are just a couple of considerations to keep in mind. Alright, so let's from here shuffle out our emission layer. So I'll drop down a shuffle and let's go inside this shuffle, and inside the node tab over here, inside the label, I will open bracket and I will say value in one and close bracket. And this is just a simple expression that will give the title to this shuffle node here. So when I go inside the shuffle and I select the emission, we will see that we are working with the emission here inside the node graph as well. So the first thing that I want to do is maybe we can smooth out these particles a little bit if I use a denoise. So let's drop down a denoise from here and let's move this gizmo somewhere around where we have particles. And we will also want to use this temporal processing option here, and for this we will need a vector layer. So I will drop down a vector generator and point the source to my emission. And now for the denoise, I will point the motion arrow here to this vector generator, and this will now enable this temporal processing option here, and I can increase the frame blending a little bit and maybe the denoise amount. And if I turn this on and off, we can see that we just smooth out the particles a little bit. Let's maybe drop down a grade and we can bring this down quite a bit. So we can also, let's maybe drop a separate grade from this and use this to modify the colors a little bit. So inside the gain here, I will maybe want to, let's increase the blue and I'll decrease the green a little bit and maybe bring some more red and just make some adjustments to this grading here. So just try to get a more interesting effect. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will bring out our mesh now. So the mesh layers, let's press R and I will bring the mesh render, and I will copy this shuffle here which has the node expression, so this value in one over here. And let's see, for this shuffle we will want to have, let's grab our Fresnel. And now from this grade node over here, let's drop down another grade node and let's point the mask to our shuffle here, so our Fresnel. And I will hold Control and add another point here and try to keep this a little bit more organized. Okay, so if I go to this grade now, we will set the mask to look at our red component, so RGBA red. And if I now decrease the gain, we can see that we are only affecting where we had values in our Fresnel. So if I go to this grade, let's maybe set this mask to invert, and now hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. So as I increase this, we can see that we are simply using this black and white layer as a mask for this grading here. Okay, so I can drop this down and I can add another grade here and again point to our Fresnel for the mask. And let's use RGBA red again, and for this one I will increase the gain. And maybe for the Fresnel as well I can add a grade node, and maybe I want to increase the gamma just a little bit. So let's take a look here. So we can see that with the second layer of grading we add a little bit of highlights around the edges, and with the first one we just isolate this middle portion here, so we turn everything dark that's not around the edges of our mesh. So we are essentially just using these grade nodes that point to our Fresnel to help bring a little bit of the outline of the mesh in the particles. So this will be fine for now, and let's see, let's shuffle out, let's copy this shuffle node over here to our mesh, and let's bring out our UVs now. So I'll set this to this UV extra, and this is the UV pass, and we can now create a noise. So I will drop down a noise here, which just looks like this by default, and if I plug this into an ST map and use the ST map, let's point this to our UV extra, and we want the UV channels to be RGB. Okay, so we can see that with this method we are mapping the noise onto our mesh. So this is because our UV coordinates. And we can go inside the noise now, and we can make some adjustments over here. Okay, and we can also go to the transform, and maybe we will animate this noise going up. So for my second value here, the Y value, I will right click and I will want to add expression, and the expression will be, let's maybe do frame multiplied by 5, and let's see the speed of this. Okay, so I think this is looking fine. We don't really need to worry what's happening outside of our mesh. We will only use this as a layer to multiply other layers. Okay, so this is fine, and we can also animate this Z offset here. So maybe I will also do, let's do frame, and let's see how this will work. And this is by default too high, so let's go back here and let's set the expression to be frame divided by maybe 50. Okay, so now hopefully this will be a little bit slower. And I think maybe this is too slow, so let's do frame divided by 25. So this will be fine. And from here, if I add a blur to this read layer, so when we first read our mesh, if I add a blur, and let's preview the result for the ST map, we can blur all the channels, and if I increase this, we can see that we are creating this kind of interesting outline here. So this will again help to bring a little bit more outline to the effect. And also I will want to add a little bit of overall distortion to this mesh. So let's maybe just duplicate this noise node. So this will be, so this is our noise. And okay, let's use this as it is for now. So I will want to shuffle this into our mesh stream over here. So I will drop down a shuffle. And let's actually set this shuffle here in between these nodes. So this will be input B, and from with this A arrow, I will point this to my noise. So we will want the input to be A, and we will want the output to be a new layer that we create. And I will select this new here and just create a new layer. So let's rename this to layer distort, and we will populate this with RGBA, and we only really need red and green for this. And I'll hit OK. So from here I will drop down an iDistort node, and we will leave the channels to all, and for UV channels we want to use the layer distort that we created. And if I increase the UV scale now, we can see that we are distorting the mesh. Alright, maybe this is a little bit too much. And also a thing that we can do here is after this noise we can drop down a grade, and we can see that by default the values for this noise don't go under 0. And in order for this iDistort node to work properly, we need both negative values and positive values. So with this grade node we can uncheck this black clamp. So we want to push our values in the negative direction, and we will just increase the black point here and maybe decrease the white point. And if I look at my grade node, we can see now that the blacks, if I just hold down Control and select an area here, we can see that it goes to a value of negative 0.1. So this is what we want. And maybe we can, let's actually select this, and we can push this even more. So this white area goes to all the way up to 0.6. So if I were to select this, maybe we can push this a little bit more, and let's go back to our distort. And now we can see that the mesh is being distorted in all directions. So if I were to disable this grade node for a second, we can see now that the distortions are skewed in one direction, and when we add the grade node, they are being pushed uniformly everywhere. So we can also add a blur node here. So let's blur this distortion a little bit, maybe a size value of 4, and we will just drop down the overall effect here. And let's maybe look at our STMap result, or rather our Fresnel result. Okay, so we add just a little bit of noise to these mesh passes as well. And let's maybe use this STMap here to multiply it with our Fresnel. So over here, after our grading for the Fresnel, I'll drop down a merge, and I will merge it with my STMap. So let's take a look at the result. So this is what we had before, and this is with the STMap. And maybe we can drop down a grade here and just make this a little bit brighter. And now we can go ahead and let's create another copy of this shuffle node, and let's bring in our final layer from the mesh element, and let's make some organization here. And for this final layer, this will be our AO. So this is the layer. Okay, and we will also want to multiply this with our STMap noise result. So let's set this operation to multiply. And we might want a grade for our AO, and I will increase the gamma a bit, and make another grade here for the noise. And finally, we can just simply add this to our main chain over here, and this will be a plus operation. Okay, let's add another dot here, and we can now do some grading for this pass as well. And let's start by increasing the gamma maybe, and the gain. And I'll do another grade node, which will be for the colors. So let's add some blue, and let's get rid of some of this red. Okay, so something like this. So this is pretty much the setup so far, and we will come to all of these grade nodes and make some adjustments later. Let's first finish the entire setup. So we will need from this pass here, so our original body PRT, let's also drop down another shuffle here, and we will bring out our reflection and our GI. So over here, this will be the GI, and I will merge this on top of everything, and we will set this operation to plus. So this will be the GI, and we will just drop down a grade, and we can increase the gain and the gamma here. Okay, and let's maybe decrease the gamma, and maybe I'll add another grade and make this a little bit more blue. Okay, so this will be fine. And let's also drop another dot here and duplicate this shuffle, and we also want to bring in the reflection as well. So let's not forget that this points to this body PRT pass. So let's merge this here on top of everything, and for this we want to import our reflection, and let's preview this result. Set this to plus, and let's drop down a grade, and we will just decrease the gain here maybe. And for the multiply, I will just make this a little bit more blue to match our other effects. Okay, so now we also have the reflection. So let's go ahead and add our core, and let's move this viewer down. So let's go ahead and press R to grab our core PRT, and I will simply merge this over everything and see how this will look. So I will set this to be plus, and let's drop down a grade here and also a dot here. So first, for my first grade, I will just drop down the gain and maybe add another grade, and I'll make this maybe slightly more blue, and I might want to add a little bit of red as well. So this is still a little bit too white. Let's go to the first grade and adjust this a little bit. So something like this. And we can probably also do the denoising thing that we did for the original, for the body particles. So let's drop down a denoise, plug this here, and let's also do a vector generator. Plug this here, the source and the motion to the vector generator, and the noise should be sampling our core here. And let's just increase this value a little bit and enable temporal processing and increase this as well. So now we also add a little bit of motion blur to this. And let's maybe, instead of this AO pass, which has this weird thing around the mouth, let's maybe just shuffle in our Fresnel instead. So I'll just set this to Fresnel, and I'll just maybe increase the gamma for this. Okay. And I think this is a little bit better. So for the glow effects, we will be using AP Glow that you can find on Nukepedia, and I will provide this link in the links file, so you can go ahead and download this. And this is my favorite glow effects in Nuke. So let's go back inside of Nuke and let's make some room here maybe. And I will drop down an AP Glow, and I will make this point to our denoised result. And let's preview this result here. We want this effect only option selected, and maybe we can play around with the response and the source black and the source white. Okay, and we want to increase the persistence and maybe decrease the intensity a little bit, and just play around with some of the settings. Let's maybe go ahead and merge this on our main chain and see how this will look. So I'll set this to plus. Okay. And this will be the glow. Let's maybe go ahead and let's see if we can increase the persistence. Okay, so I think this is looking pretty good. Maybe this is a little bit too much. We can also go all the way back here where we did our first grading, and we can affect the particles, the core particles from here. So this will also update the glow as well. So just try to find a nice balance between the glow and the overall brightness. But I think this is fine. Let's also go ahead, and I want to also add a glow effect here after we do the grading for the body PRT. So let's drop down another AP Glow over here, point this to our second grade with the mask, and I will merge this in our stream, and I'll set this to plus. So let's preview this, and we can decrease the response, and we will increase the persistence, and maybe also decrease the source black, so we only get these very nice highlights. Okay, and let's preview this. And maybe we can let's maybe adjust some of the grading here. So I think this is looking pretty good. We might want to maybe increase just the distortion a little bit for our meshes here. So I'll grab this distort and maybe bring down the blur a little bit. So add a little bit more detail in the distortion. And let's preview this. And finally, the last effect that we will add is going to be the smoke. So let's press R, let's bring in the smoke, and let's simply merge this on top of everything. And let's add another dot here, and let's go ahead and drop down a grade and bring this all the way down, and bring the gamma down, and just play around with the gain and the gamma. So we really want a very subtle effect with this smoke. Let's maybe drop another grade, and let's go to the multiply, and I'll make this a little bit more blue. And let's make sure that this is set to plus. Okay. So maybe to my first grade, I'll just increase the color here. And again, this will be just a very subtle effect that kind of, it's kind of like an aura that will break up the silhouette of the mesh a little bit, just so it doesn't have this clear delimitation between the background and the mesh itself. So just a very subtle effect that hopefully adds a little bit of interest to this effect. And one final thing that we can do here is maybe we can just drop down a sharpen filter, and we will just sharpen this up a little bit. So I'll make sure that the size isn't too strong, and maybe I think a size of 1 is pretty good. Maybe even 2. I think 2 is too much, so maybe 1.4. Okay, I think this is good. And one final thing that I want to do is I will create a merge here, and I want to blur everything. So let's over to the left, I will drop down a blur and link it to this sharpen. And actually this sharpen should be the last thing that happens, so I'll just disconnect this. Let's plug the blur inside our last merge node over here, and let's go ahead and I will just blur this out by a lot. So I'll just increase this value here, and I just want to use this sort of like an ambient light. So if I merge this over in our mainstream, you can kind of see how this will work. So I'll set this to plus, and from here I will drop down a grade, and I just want to drop down the gain, and I will increase the blur maybe even more, and maybe increase the gain. So you can kind of see if I turn this on and off, we just add a little bit more of an ambient light that's generated, mainly because this effect, since this is glowing so strong, we might want to have a little bit more light in our scene overall. So I just so this is the effect basically, and I think this looks a little bit more kind of physically accurate. Okay, so this is the final thing here, and let's bring back the sharpen, and let's make the final preview. So this will be the final result, and with that we conclude this tutorial. So I hope you learned some new things and that you enjoyed this tutorial, and hopefully we will see each other again in a new video.